Hello, everyone. My name is Tonson Sango, and welcome to another episode of Life in Pages, where we discuss with authors about their book, but also about the chapters or pages of their lives. So today we've got a special guest with in the person of Roger Barton, and I've also got Jiko here with me from Books to Africa. Give us a wave. So without further ado, Roger is the author of one of his books here, which is Waiting for the Rains. And there's a follow-up book, which is Incident at Barber's Ridge. Now, I'm going to pass over to Roger to introduce himself and tell us, Roger, if your life was a book, what will be the chapters of your life? And please introduce yourself as well.
Yes, my name is Roger Barton, and I'm pleased to be with Books to Africa. I was recruited way back. I've been going in and out of Africa for many years, and my original recruitment started way back in 1970, and I've been on a contract basis working for governments in both Malawi and Zambia for a good many years. And when I quit those jobs, I've been going back to visit people and places I've known for over a good many years. And so I built up I think probably quite a large experience of living in countries which few tourists actually get to. They're not popular. They're not like Kenya or South Africa, where there's more tourists. I was living in, but traveling around, I was living mainly in Malawi and Zambia for a good number of years, and I produced, when I left, my first book, Waiting for the Rains, which Tonson has actually introduced, which is, I think, can be seen here, and it's an autobiography. And this was my first book. Took a good many years to get going, but it was published way back in 2012, actually. So it includes not only my experiences, but also a lot of my what's happened since I left working there. And so that's my basis, and
Great.
we can go on from there.
Yeah, thank you, Roger. And if you don't mind, just before we get into the book, if you just hold up the book one more time. So it's Waiting for the Rains, so everyone can have a look. You guys, you can get it on Amazon, you can get it on Blackwell's, everywhere books are sold. And so we're going to really try and delve in and now talk about the book. So, Roger, Waiting for the Rain sounds like a drought.
Yes.
What inspired the title of this book?
It's probably the title was inspired by the fact that Malawi and lots of countries in the Savannah Belt are actually agricultural based. They don't rely upon oil or gas or minerals or things that you dig up out of the earth. They rely upon agriculture as a basic substance. And in order to produce the agriculture, rains are going to be needed. And it's dry for 6 months of the year, practically with hardly any rain at all. And so there becomes a time when there's an expectancy of rain. The fields are planted, the seeds are put in, and people are waiting literally for the rains to start. Because unless the rains start, the crops won't grow, and their economy and their livelihood goes into decline, both in the commercial sector and in the traditional villages and their way of life across the country will be won't be actually terminated, but will be a great hazard to be able to live the proper life that they're expected to, because the crops don't grow, and without the crops they don't have the livelihood that they really want. And so this was the inspiration for the title is actually just, I would say, typically of what goes on for a couple of months before the actual rain starts. There's a waiting period where if it's delayed, there's a problem, and if the rains come too heavy, there's a disaster. If they're not good enough and it's too light, then that's a problem too. It's got to be a Goldilocks sort of time. It's got to be just right in order to get the crops growing and their livelihoods to continue. So that was really the basis of where the title came from.
And were you in Africa at this time during this dry period? And what was the experience like? It sounds like
in fact, my initial period of living in Africa was over all the way through the 70s into the early 80s, and I was there working for both the Malawi government and the Zambian government in their printing and stationery department, and that was my job there. And I was training recruits in these departments to take over when I left, and that was basically what my job was. And so I experienced not only the dry periods from year to year, but the rains, how it worked, what happened when they came, when they didn't arrive on time, if they were too heavy, if they were too light. The basis of their whole agriculture was coined around the type of rain that the country would get. And unless it comes at the right time, at the right rate, there's going to be a potential disaster for the people who expect rains to grow their crops. So it's very simple in a way, and the waiting for the rains is typical of what even today, where 80% of the population are agricultural based, and so they at this time the waiting for this year is over, and I understand the rains were good, and the crops were performing in the way they should be. So that was the basis for the title of the book. I should say the book itself is divided into numerous chapters on transport, the people, the politics, the weather, transport, all divided into sections. So it's not like a novel where you actually start at the beginning, and if you miss a couple of chapters, you wonder what's going on. You can go straight to the section on transport, and I've got a section there which will deal with what it's like traveling about on buses, trains, etc. And there'll be another bit about politics and what it's like living under the regimes that I was experiencing. So yes, so it's easy to navigate.
Yeah, and while you were talking about rains, it kind of crossed my mind about climate change. I mean, what are your views on climate change, and do you feel like, because obviously, I mean, I grew up in Nigeria as well, and I kind of fully understand what it's like when the rains finally come after a dry season, and it kind of, the farmers are all praying for the rain, and everyone is excited, and, it's almost like rain is seen as a blessing. Do you think there's something that we have lost perhaps here in Britain or in the West about the significance of the earth and the climate and those kinds of things?
Yes, I think that this year, typically so, where the effects of the incredible drought that we've got has affected, even here, the drought has affected the way our crops are grown, the livelihoods of farmers who are dependent on selling crops. And so, indeed, the climate change has affected the lives of people in the Western countries. We're not immune from it. And even more so in countries which rely upon a traditional style of rain, which would come at a certain time at the right amount. They are also going to be impacted by the differences. And there's been, I think, not this year, but last year, the rains in southern Africa were disastrous. It doesn't always get the publicity it deserves, but there was a huge, in southern Malawi and most of Mozambique, there was a bridges and roads were washed away, crops were destroyed because the excessive rains were just happening at the wrong time and too heavy, too prolonged, and it was destroying people's livelihoods because there's just too much rain. That was the previous season, I think, but it comes and goes. This season, I think, has been particularly okay.
Yeah, we want to hear. Obviously, you said you were in Malawi and Zambia in the sort of 80s and 70s, right?
Yes,
And you were in sort of publishing, is that right? And into
yes, in the
and so on.
government printing department
Government
I was
printing department.
involved with.
So, what first of all, what was it like? As a young, Briton, found yourself in the middle of Africa. What was it like? What did you? Was there any sort of experiences or stories you can tell us that were perhaps shocking or sort of your first experience?
Well,
How you kind of managed to
when
adapt?
I went out there, first of all, I mean, it was a time when even holidays to Spain were only just getting started. And when people, and to go out into the hinterland of Africa was something which friends of mine, I was recruited. I just saw the advertisement in the local paper and applied. And and it was through what was called the Crown Agents at that time. I was recruited, and eventually was accepted after a very long medicals and interviews and so on, which went on for quite a considerable time. People wondered where on earth I was going to. They thought I was a sort of like a latter-day Livingstone or something. I was going to be going through rapids in order to get. And I said, no, they have a flight once a week, and they thought they'd just never see me again. And one of the my wife went with me at the time, and in order to prepare for what was quite a distance location, there was all sorts of literature. It was very well thought out by the overseas aid scheme that I was working for in Britain, and there was books on tropical diseases because people didn't realise necessarily what, in fact, they were going to come up against, all the different terrible bugs and diseases which you could come across. There was all sorts of and settling in, what it was like to live there. So there was and also the medical was lengthy to make sure that you were going to survive once you got there. So it was quite a long process in actually getting there. I wanted to make sure that but once you were there, but you were up to the job and weren't going to shrink because of the heat, because of possibility of terrible insects that you'd come across. And so, and one of the things I remember, I didn't really do my homework. I did it probably enough, but I thought it was something like, it was going to be something like a wet season like the Congo has. But no, as we came into, I came in October, which was the height of the dry season, and it was just a dust bowl everywhere. It hadn't rained for months, and so therefore everything was completely dry. And one of the things which always stuck in my mind, that after landing, it was the colours which attracted me. After leaving October Britain with grey skies and everything was dull and dismal, and it's suddenly a sunlit vista of blue skies, the people in their colourful dresses. Directly I left the airport, I was picked up by someone from the department, and I can always remember how colourful everything was. The people in bright dresses, the blue sky, the red dust of the earth blowing up in clouds, and the people in every colour that you can imagine. And this impacted straight out of the airport. Where the villages went almost up to the runway was something which just stayed in my memory. That first encounter with what was actually being in Africa, and how it affected me. So that was my first appearance of views about being in Africa and how it affected me.
And what would you say? In what way would you say that living in Africa since then, and now obviously you're back in the UK, how has that shaped your life and the way you view your worldview of life?
I think a lot of people in Western countries, they they hear very often just the terrible stories about what goes on in Africa, the tragedies of droughts, the casualties that go on, and it's not, obviously it's not like that at all. There's another life which goes on, and I think that people don't realise what actually happens in Africa. They just get news clips, whereas when you've been there and actually lived in that situation and seen it firsthand, not only once but many times, you realise that the complexity and what in fact is actually happening out there. And you look at news reports which are away from the BBC One and the ITV. You get news reports and you want to know more about what it is, and also, of course, you communicate much better these days with the internet, and so I think you get a much wider perspective of things. You appreciate what happens much more than whatever you did if you had never been there. And most people here have got very little idea of the complexities and the type of lives that people live in Africa. They've got no idea. If you ask them, they've got something in between, based on Tarzan and something, and on squatter camps. That's the only sort of vision that they have. And of course, it's really, I find it difficult to relate to people here. If you wanted to speak to people about where you've been, had you been visiting, living in Spain, they got some sort of attitude. They know what happens there. But if you want to try and communicate and mention something about the life in Africa, they would be at a loss, because you're coming from different perspectives. And so I think people who have been to Africa and lived there for a long time, especially communicating with, living amongst the local people, it changes your lifestyle and it changes your attitude about people and how they live and what makes them tick. And this has certainly happened to me. And what I should say, that one of the things which I didn't expect, not only I mentioned about the colours and the blue sky and everything of that sort, is the politics of countries, mainly in that they don't always operate on a scheme where we think we've got it all sorted out. We elect people, a parliamentary democracy. It doesn't always work like that in Africa. And people, once they had gone away from the colonial, because I was there shortly after the demise of the colonial system and the local person that was taking over, you find that if that person's good and he knows what the country wants, and possibly, even though there's not a parliamentary democracy behind him, then it works. But once it happens that someone gets into power who's corrupt, and my goodness, that did happen on several occasions. Should I mention Zimbabwe and possibly Angola as examples of this? Then the country is, the people just don't come away from being poor. The rich get richer and the poor people just stay as they are, and there's little in the way of changing that system. And it requires, that's why there's so many perhaps riots when there is a new person to be elected. And this is the other thing which possibly affected my judgment of what goes on there, which I didn't realise so much until I'd actually got there and experienced it firsthand.
Absolutely. I mean, I think actually it's good that you mentioned politics. And again, just a reminder, guys, that we're talking to Roger about his book, Waiting for the Rains, which you've got a copy there, Roger, to
Yes. This is my autobiography.
Yeah,
about what happens there, and also it was a follow-up a few years later, which was
Instead
in
of,
Barber's Reef. It was again. It's about a conflict between the indigenous people who've got a right to the land and the settlers who took it over perhaps generations ago. Each has got a, and why I've termed it all conflicts are not the same, because both have got a legitimate right. And perhaps we saw this in Zimbabwe, where the farmers were looking after the land. It was a breadbasket of Africa, but the people wanted their land back. But it was done in the wrong way. They were turned out and went off. The land was given to people without the experience, local people, and it went into the economy just disintegrated. And that, obviously, that's not the way to do it. And these very same farmers that were, well, the country sort of disintegrated into under Mugabe, into which most he's probably one of the only leaders that people know about. And those same farmers eventually went to Mozambique, where a similar situation was handled much better. So yes, that was one of the things which I didn't expect to see, and it certainly affected my judgment of. I should say that in Malawi they had Banda, who was in charge of things. Autocratic, yes, but honest, and knew what the country wanted. He would tolerate no dissent, but he knew what the country wanted. He knew it was based on agriculture, and therefore everything he did was in that direction. And the country was possibly one of the most successful in that area.
I think, the more I think about leadership these days, I'm realizing how important leadership is, that the person you have at the top, is very, very important because they kind of set the tone for the entire country, the entire cabinet, the entire government, and if I was to ask you, I mean, from your experience, during the 70s, the post-colonial period, the 70s, the 80s, and, as a keen follower of African affairs, till today, what would you say are the kind of top three biggest problems facing Africa, and how do we solve them? I know it's a big question, but, it'd be interesting to hear your thoughts,
Yes, okay. I think people don't realize just how big and complex Africa is. There's it's what is it now? It takes up. It's the second biggest continent after Asia. It covers 30 million cubic square kilometers. It requires 20% of the land of the earth is in Africa, and there's about 5 different countries that would fit. I don't know if this may help a little bit to say, but you can fit the China, USA, India, most of Europe, the Britain, Spain, France, and Germany will all fit within the borders of Africa, and then of course there's the complexity of the minerals, which all countries are sort of after now, everything from oil to diamonds and so on. So with this complexity, there's likely to be the biggest problems which I saw was corruption and encouraging, and there's an incredible amount of quality youth. Most of the average age, I think, is under 20 years, and that potential is dynamic, and it's got to find an outlet, and it's finding its outlet in Kenya. There's a lot of entrepreneurs who are conducting mobile phones, and a lot of people have got mobile phones now. And I suppose really is managing what they've got, the cotton, the uranium, the oil, the gold, the coffee, managing it in a proper way, and if necessary, bringing in experts to do it, but also to try to eliminate the corruption. I was just noting that in Angola, they just ousted a whatever his name is, Santos. Now he was in charge and corrupt. It milked off all of the much of the oil which comes out of the country. His daughter Isabella is one of the richest people in the world. She's been banned from. Her assets are something like $2 billion. She's been banned from entering the United States because of her of corruption and her milking off of profits, and is possibly one of the biggest examples of corruption which you can ever get. And so that is, and also of course to try and eliminate in politics the local squabbles which go on, settle them in a way, and there's squabbles going on of a major kind, both in Cameroon, in the north of the country, in Sudan, the south, it's got problems. In Mali, there's problems going on there. There's still haven't settled Angola. That's still a problem happening. Of course, notwithstanding anything, is the Congo, which in the eastern part of Congo there's still disruption and quite a lot of discontent going on. So these squabbles do need to be sorted, and until they do, Africa is not going to develop in the way. I remember just before the pandemic, our Prime Minister hosted a conference from Africa, and in it he spoke of that Africa is going to be one of the major contributors and trading partners of Britain in the next 10 years. And it probably is true that there's so much there and there's so much potential, but these basic problems of corruption and politics do need to be sorted out. Easier said than done, of course.
Yeah, definitely easier said than done. Funny you mentioned our Prime Minister here in the UK. I mean, because a problem like corruption, it's almost every country has elements of, corruption. How do you solve a problem like corruption, Roger?
Yes, and as you say, it's happening here as well. Only it's just only in Africa, it's taken to the uttermost level of which rarely gets into the papers in the way that it should do here. But with so much wealth, not only from its young population, but in the minerals that Africa has got, there's possibly, and knowing how loose the political system is, it's probably not surprising that there will be an element of corruption. And as I say, it's taken to the utmost level. Other countries manage it okay. There's elections due to take place in Kenya very shortly, but it's always handled them very well. Botswana, of course, is an example of how, even though it's got a lot of diamonds and so on, it does in fact have a stable democracy. And but they are examples of countries which are which defy the normal rules which have gone on. So yes.
No, thank you, Roger. I mean, it's a difficult one, but I think that one thing we can all say is we're definitely rooting for Africa. We want things to get better. We want to be part of the solution in our own way. For example, Books to Africa through education, but also through awareness, through your book. And again, just a reminder for everyone watching that we're talking about Roger's book, his memoir, Waiting for the Rain, but also his second book, Incident at Barber's Ridge, would really highlight some of the issues that Africa is facing with, or and is still facing today. I know I've been doing most of the talking. Jiko is on the train today. Jiko, are you able to speak at all? Do you have any question for Roger before we round up?
Yes, so I would like to go back to the topic about writing. So I have a question for Roger. Do you have any advice on self-publication for new writers?
Oh yes. Yes. One of the questions, apart from what Jaco has said, but well, I'll deal with that question first. But self-publication is not necessarily cheap. The research has got to be done, and it be able to employ others when they're needed. So after you've written a book, it needs to have an editor, someone who is distant from it, much more distant than you, the author. Someone wants to edit it and see things that you probably never needed existing, that you never knew were there. It's got to look good. If you do everything yourself without the necessary experience, it could have a tatty appearance. You want it to be as professional and as good as and better than most of the books on your library shelves. So in that case, you need someone who's going to put the text together and make up the pages and chapters in a style which it makes a book look good. And you need and also a good cover, something dramatic that looks good, it attracts a reader. I know you don't judge a book by the cover, but just the same, it could be the first thing that makes you want to pick the book up. To get people to do this is not too difficult if you feel that it's too daunting for you to do it yourself, and that would be there are sites out there where you can hire people to do it. I should say, my first book, because of my background in printing and publishing, I did it all myself, the whole thing. I just got someone to do the cover. But on my other book, Incident, I hired an editor to have a look at the text after I'd finished it, who came from London. I hired a graphic designer who come from Serbia to put the cover together. The actual composition of the pages was done by someone in Poland, and the printing of the book was done near where I live in Leeds. And all that fitted together without any problems at all. So I would say, but if you, and also, of course, the advertising, it wants to be on Kindle, Amazon, have an ISBN number, and advertise it at book fairs whenever possible. And also write about what you know. People are very, some of the comments which I've got about people who reviewed my book is that they could tell by the way I wrote it, I'd been there and seen what was going on. And I think you want to write about things that you know is an important guide. One of the other things was I was looking at I think something about what was it? Oh, it's something I think Thompson, you mentioned about what the problems of being an expat were in countries like I was living in. And I sort of thought about this over a long time. You lose contact. You've got to be someone who can leave their friends and family behind and not worry about finding a new life in a new place in a completely different situation. You've got to, if there's a children involved, they probably want to have to go leave you for several months of the year, because one of the advantages of being an expat is you get lots of educational amounts of money thrown in. But they're going to go away to possibly a good school, a good boarding school in England or in another country in Europe. I remember in Malawi, they were called lollipop flights. where there's so many children who were being bussed in and bussed out on the long distance flights, but they were called lollipop flights. There were the children that grew up as children of an expat. They're sometimes called Miss Kids. And I've got in my autobiography, I've got some details about these where they only know of life in their first few years where they grew up. And so to go and take them out of that life and into another one, into a school in Western country, is quite a traumatic experience for them. And I seem to remember in the very early days, a lot of expats that went into upcountry areas for extended periods used to have elaborate dressing up to stop them from going into a disintegration. There's a problem with if their wives can't handle the situation of where they are living, they sometimes get involved in the local women and the where they are targeted. There's often problems of drink because the local people are sort of endowed with this quality as well, and so there's a tendency to lose contact. They know nothing else except this lifestyle, and to come back. I've known people who've come back to the Western world find that they don't recognize it anymore and go back to where they came from.
Wow, and that's quite profound, isn't it?
So it is difficult. There's the advantages are you're well paid and you but there's no pension or anything of that sort usually. And so yes, there are advantages. You get well paid and looked after, but you become isolated from your home territory, and that's what you've got to expect.
Well, thank you for that, Roger. That's very insightful. Look, there's more in Roger's book, guys. So again, we're going to put some links to buy the book. Please click on the links below the video on YouTube to get Roger's book, Waiting for the Rains and Incident at Barber's Bridge. If you fancy that trip down his memory lane to have a look at, those experiences in Africa and, a bit of nostalgia, perhaps. And there's a lot of interesting discussions there and topics to really grapple with around land and, really what, the issues, the conflicts that we have in Africa and really what's really at the bottom of it. And of course, again, keep supporting Books to Africa, everyone watching. If you are watching online on the YouTube, Facebook, social media, wherever it is, keep supporting the charity. We thank you and we appreciate you for watching. Thank you, Roger, for your time with us today.
Okay, Giko, and of course Thompson for having an enjoyable session. I appreciate it. Nice to speak to you, and wonderful to be in touch with you. Thanks very much for this interview. I liked it very much.
All right, no problem, Roger. Do come back again at some point. We'll talk a bit more about African politics, maybe. But yeah, thank you. Giko, thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right, bye.